pricing snapped? This lounge is reserved for our premium members only. You'll need to find somewhere else to wait.
The words sliced through the ambient hum of LAX airport like a blade through silk. Victoria Ashford didn't even look up from her computer screen when she delivered them. Her perfectly manicured fingers painted in deep burgundy continued typing with the precision of someone who had said those exact words countless times before. Behind her designer glasses, her blue eyes finally lifted to meet the woman standing at the reception desk. Victoria's blonde hair was swept into an elegant chignon, not a strand out of place despite the California heat outside. Her burgundy blazer was tailored to perfection, complementing the silk blouse underneath and the pearls at her throat. Everything about her screamed authority, privilege, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. The woman she was addressing stood quietly holding a boarding pass and a small crossbody bag. Zara Williams, 32 years old, looked nothing like the typical first-class passenger Victoria was accustomed to serving. Her dark jeans were comfortable but unremarkable, her navy sweater soft but simple, and her black sneakers showed the wear of someone who actually walked places instead of being chauffeured everywhere. What Victoria couldn't see was the exhaustion in Zara's dark eyes. The red-eye flight from New York had landed just 2 hours ago, following a grueling board meeting that had stretched past midnight. Zara had deliberately chosen her most comfortable clothes for the long journey ahead. A 12-hour flight to London for another set of meetings that would determine the future of thousands of employees. I have a first-class ticket," Zara said evenly, sliding her boarding pass across the marble reception desk. Flight 447 to Heathrow departing at 6. Victoria glanced at the boarding pass with the same expression she might use to examine something unpleasant stuck to her shoe. The Skybridge Airlines Premier Lounge at LAX was her domain, and she had been managing it for 3 years. In that time, she had developed what she considered an excellent eye for spotting people who didn't belong. Victoria said, her tone dripping with skepticism. She picked up the boarding pass between 2 fingers as if contact with it might somehow contaminate her. This is interesting. The lounge around them buzzed with the quiet activity of affluent travelers. Leather chairs were occupied by men and women in expensive business attire, their laptops, open phones pressed to their ears as they conducted million-dollar deals between sips of complimentary champagne. The wall-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the tarmac where Skybridge's fleet of aircraft sat like sleeping giants. "Is there a problem?" Zara asked, though she already knew where this was heading. She had seen that look before, felt that tone of voice cut through her like a familiar wound. At 24, she had been turned away from a hotel in Chicago despite having a confirmed reservation. At 27, a car rental agency had demanded 3 forms of ID and a credit check that no other customers seemed to require. Now, at 32, standing in the lounge of an airline where she served on the board of directors, the same assumptions were being made about her right to exist in spaces that others took for granted. "Well," Victoria said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "we've had some issues lately with fraudulent boarding passes. You understand." Marcus Rodriguez, the young Hispanic man working the front desk beside Victoria, shifted uncomfortably. At 26, he had been working at the lounge for 8 months, and he had never seen Victoria request additional verification from passengers whose tickets had already been processed by the airline's computer system. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "the system shows her reservation as valid. She's booked in seat 2A. Victoria shot him a sharp look that could have frozen water. "Marcus, I think I know how to do my job." She turned back to Zara, her smile as cold as her tone. "I'm going to need some additional verification. Proof of payment for this ticket, perhaps, or some identification showing you're authorized to use this particular booking?" The request hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, other passengers had begun to notice the commotion. A woman at a nearby table lowered her magazine. A businessman paused his phone conversation. The atmosphere in the lounge, typically one of calm efficiency, had suddenly become charged with tension. Zara reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license and credit card, placing them next to the boarding pass. "Here's my ID. The ticket was purchased on the company account. Victoria examined the documents with theatrical skepticism, holding them up to the light as if checking for watermarks. Company account, she repeated her tone, suggesting she found this explanation highly suspicious. And which company would that be? The question was loaded with assumptions, each word carefully chosen to imply that someone like Zara couldn't possibly have legitimate access to corporate travel accounts. It was a masterclass in discrimination disguised as customer service protocol. Skybridge Airlines, Zara replied simply. For just a moment, Victoria's confidence flickered. Something about the way Zara said those words with quiet certainty rather than defensiveness gave her pause. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed suspicion. "I see," Victoria said, though clearly she didn't. "Well, I'm still going to need to verify this with our security team." The situation had attracted more attention than Zara would have preferred. From her position near a pillar, Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old travel blogger with striking red hair and keen journalistic instincts, had been watching the exchange with growing concern. She recognized the signs of what was unfolding. She had written about similar incidents in hotels, restaurants, and airports across the country. Sarah discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording her screen, capturing Victoria's increasingly aggressive posture and Zara's remarkably calm demeanor. This wasn't her first time documenting discrimination, and something told her this incident was going to be particularly significant. "Ma'am?" Marcus tried again, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned toward Victoria. "The reservation shows she's authorized for lounge access. Her ticket is valid in our system." Victoria's response was swift and cutting. "Marcus, if you can't handle following proper security protocols, perhaps you need retraining." Her voice carried across the lounge like a whip crack, causing several passengers to look up from their tablets and newspapers. Jennifer Walsh, the 45-year-old assistant manager, had been sorting through passenger manifests when she heard Victoria's raised voice. She approached the desk with the kind of practiced smile that customer service managers perfect after years of dealing with complaints. "Is everything all right here?" Jennifer asked, though her tone suggested she had already decided which side of the conflict she would support. "We have a passenger with questionable documentation," Victoria explained, gesturing toward Zara as if she were discussing a suspicious package rather than a human being. "I'm following standard verification procedures." Jennifer nodded approvingly, her blonde ponytail bouncing with the motion. "Of course, we can't be too careful these days." She looked at Zara with the same skeptical expression Victoria had been wearing. "Ma'am, I'm sure you understand that we have to protect our premium passengers." The implication was clear. Zara was not considered a premium passenger despite holding a first-class ticket and standing in a lounge reserved exclusively for such travelers. She was an outsider, an intruder, someone who needed to be contained before she disrupted the careful order of their establishment. "I understand perfectly," Zara replied, her voice steady, despite the growing circle of eyes upon her. "What I don't understand is why my valid boarding pass and identification aren't sufficient when they would be for anyone else." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Victoria's jaw tightened in response. She had spent 3 years building her reputation as someone who maintained the exclusivity of the Premier Lounge, someone who could spot troublemakers and remove them before they caused problems for legitimate passengers. Anyone else doesn't typically have issues with documentation. Victoria shot back, her professional mask beginning to slip. Anyone else doesn't usually require this level of examination. Robert Coleman, a 52-year-old pilot for Skybridge Airlines, had been reading his flight manual in a corner chair when the exchange began. As a black man who had spent 25 years fighting for respect in the aviation industry, he recognized exactly what was happening. He opened his phone's camera app and began recording from his position across the lounge. "Excuse me," Robert said, standing and walking toward the desk. His captain's uniform immediately commanded attention, the 4 stripes on his shoulders marking him as a senior pilot. "Is there a problem here?" Victoria's demeanor shifted slightly at the sight of Robert's uniform. Company employees, especially pilots, were typically accorded a level of respect that passengers, even first-class passengers, rarely received. Captain Coleman Victoria said, reading his name tag, "No problem at all. Just following standard security protocols with this passenger." Robert looked at Zara's boarding pass, which was still lying on the desk. Standard protocols for a first-class passenger with valid documentation. His tone was carefully neutral, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "Well," Jennifer interjected, moving to support her manager. "We've had some issues recently with people attempting to access premium areas without proper authorization. Have you—" Robert asked, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Because I've been flying for this airline for over 2 decades, and I've never heard of passengers being interrogated in the Premier Lounge for carrying valid first-class boarding passes." The tension in the air became almost palpable. Other passengers were now openly staring, their conversations forgotten as they watched the drama unfold. Maria Santos, a 29-year-old lounge attendant who had been refilling the coffee station, paused in her work to listen. Maria had worked in customer service long enough to recognize discrimination when she saw it, and what she was witnessing made her stomach turn. She had seen Victoria treat other passengers, white passengers, wealthy-looking passengers, with courtesy and deference. The contrast in behavior was stark and undeniable. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her position to get a better angle for her recording, making sure to capture both Victoria's aggressive stance and Zara's composed responses. The footage was already compelling, but she had the sense that this was just the beginning of something much larger. "Look," Victoria said, her voice rising with frustration, "I don't care who you are or what uniform you're wearing. I am the manager of this lounge, and I decide who gets access. This woman's documentation is suspicious, and I have every right to verify it through proper channels." She reached across the desk and took Zara's boarding pass, holding it up like evidence in a court case. "Until security clears this, she doesn't get access to premium services." The act of physically taking the boarding pass crossed a line that everyone in the lounge could feel. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Marcus stepped back from the desk, clearly uncomfortable with how far the situation had escalated. "You just confiscated a passenger's valid boarding pass," Robert said, his voice now carrying the authority that had commanded flight crews for decades. "That's not protocol, that's harassment." Victoria's cheeks flushed with anger and embarrassment, but she doubled down on her position. "I'm doing my job. If you don't like how I run this lounge, you can take it up with management." Zara, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the suddenly silent lounge. "That won't be necessary," she said, reaching for her phone. "I think management is about to become very aware of this situation." The phone call Zara made was brief, lasting less than 30 seconds. She spoke quietly, her back turned to the desk where Victoria still held her boarding pass like a trophy. The few words the nearby passengers could hear were professional and measured. "It's happening again. Yes, at LAX. I need Elena here immediately." When she ended the call and turned back to face Victoria, there was something different in her expression. Not anger, not frustration, but a kind of sad recognition that this moment had been inevitable. "Security is on their way," Victoria announced loudly, clearly intending for everyone in the lounge to hear. "We don't take chances with passenger safety and lounge security." David Torres, a 35-year-old Hispanic security officer, arrived within minutes. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor professional, but when he looked at the scene before him, a calm black woman surrounded by agitated airline staff, his expression grew troubled. "What seems to be the problem here?" David asked, directing his question to Victoria but keeping his eyes on the broader situation. "This woman is attempting to access the Premier Lounge with questionable documentation." Victoria explained, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate support from authority figures. "I've confiscated her boarding pass pending verification." David looked at the boarding pass in Victoria's hand, then at Zara, then at the growing crowd of passengers who were openly filming the encounter with their phones. As a security professional, he had been trained to de-escalate situations, not amplify them. "Ma'am," he said to Zara, "can you explain your side of what's happening here?" I presented a valid first-class boarding pass and proper identification. Zara replied calmly. The computer system verified my reservation. Despite this, the lounge manager has decided to confiscate my documents and deny me access based on what appears to be nothing more than her personal judgment about whether I look like I belong here. The words hung in the air like an accusation that no one could ignore. Around the lounge, passengers exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry. A few had their phones out, broadcasting live to social media platforms where the incident was already beginning to spread. Sarah Mitchell had been recording for nearly 15 minutes now, and the footage was damning. Victoria's aggressive posture, her theatrical examination of valid documents, her loudly announced assumptions about Zara's legitimacy. All of it was captured in high definition and already being uploaded to her travel blog's social media accounts. "I've been flying first class for years," said an elderly woman sitting near the windows, her voice carrying clearly across the lounge. "I've never been asked to prove anything beyond my boarding pass. This is ridiculous." "Absolutely ridiculous," agreed another passenger, a businessman who had been working on his laptop. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives airlines a bad reputation." Victoria's face was growing redder with each comment from the crowd. She had expected support from fellow passengers, not criticism. The situation was spiraling beyond her control, but her pride prevented her from backing down. "Look," she said, raising her voice to address the entire lounge, "I don't care what any of you think. I have a responsibility to protect this lounge and its legitimate passengers from people who don't belong here." The phrase, "people who don't belong here," landed like a bomb in the crowded space. The discriminatory implication was so blatant that even passengers who had been trying to stay out of the conflict couldn't ignore it. Maria Santos, who had been watching from behind the coffee station, finally found her voice. "Victoria," she said quietly, but loud enough to be heard, "she has a first-class ticket. Her name is in our system. What more do you want?" Victoria whirled around to face her employee. "Maria, you're out of line. Get back to work." But Maria didn't move. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is wrong, and you know it's wrong. You're treating her differently because what Victoria demanded her professional facade now completely abandoned. Because I'm doing my job. Because I'm protecting our premium passengers from freeloaders and scam artists." The ugly words spilled out of her like poison, confirming what everyone in the lounge already knew but hadn't heard stated so explicitly. Robert Coleman stepped forward, his pilot's uniform lending weight to his words. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "you're out of line, way out of line. This passenger has done nothing wrong, and your behavior is completely inappropriate." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Victoria snapped back. "I've been managing this lounge for 3 years, and I've never had problems with security until people like her started trying to take advantage of our services." David Torres, who had been hoping to calm the situation, realized that de-escalation was no longer possible. Victoria's words were being recorded by multiple passengers, and the incident was already beyond containment. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "I think we need to step back and reassess this situation. This passenger appears to have valid documentation, and she appears to have nothing." Victoria interrupted. "And I'm calling airport police to have her removed. This is private property, and I want her gone." The threat to call airport police marked the point of no return. Victoria reached for the desk phone with theatrical determination, her burgundy nails clicking against the handset as she dialed. Around the lounge, passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Every eye was focused on the unfolding drama. "Airport Police," Victoria said into the phone, her voice loud enough to ensure everyone could hear her. "I need officers at the Skybridge Premier Lounge immediately. We have an unauthorized individual refusing to leave the premises." Zara stood perfectly still throughout Victoria's call, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago that remaining calm in moments of crisis was not just a matter of personal dignity, it was strategic. Every word Victoria spoke, every aggressive gesture she made was being recorded and would soon be seen by thousands of people online. When Victoria hung up the phone, she turned to face Zara with a smile of triumphant satisfaction. "Airport police will be here in 5 minutes," she announced. "You can explain to them why you think you have a right to access premium services you haven't paid for." The accusation of not paying for services was the final insult in a series of increasingly outrageous assumptions. Several passengers audibly gasped. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her phone angle to capture Victoria's satisfied expression alongside Zara's composed response. "You have no idea what you've just done," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made Victoria's smile falter slightly. "I've done my job," Victoria replied, but there was less certainty in her voice now. Something about Zara's calm confidence was beginning to unnerve her. "Have you?" Zara asked. The question was simple, but it carried implications that Victoria was only beginning to understand. Robert Coleman checked his watch and looked toward the lounge entrance where he could see uniformed officers approaching through the glass doors. "This is about to get very interesting," he murmured to Maria Santos, who nodded grimly. The airport police officers, 2 of them both looking like they would rather be anywhere else, entered the lounge with the weary expressions of professionals who had seen too many customer service disputes turn ugly. "Someone called about an unauthorized person," the lead officer asked, looking around at the crowd of well-dressed passengers, all of whom appeared to belong exactly where they were. Victoria pointed directly at Zara. "Her. She's refusing to leave." The officer looked at Zara, taking in her calm demeanor and the boarding pass still clutched in Victoria's hand. "Ma'am," he said to Zara, "what's your side of this?" Zara smiled for the first time since the encounter began. "Officer, I think you're about to find out exactly why I haven't left." The timing was perfect, almost choreographed. As the police officers were still processing the scene before them, Elena Rodriguez appeared at the lounge entrance like a force of nature. The 31-year-old Hispanic woman moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling corporate crises, her professional attire and tablet case marking her as executive-level staff. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just any employee, she was Zara Williams's executive assistant, a Harvard MBA who had chosen to work behind the scenes rather than pursue the spotlight of corporate leadership. Her loyalty to Zara was absolute, and her efficiency in crisis management was legendary within Skybridge Airlines. "I'm here," Elena said simply, approaching Zara with the kind of understated professionalism that spoke volumes about their working relationship. Victoria, who had been expecting to watch Zara be escorted away by police, felt her first real twinge of uncertainty. The arrival of someone who clearly belonged in corporate circles shifted the dynamic in ways she couldn't quite understand. "And you are?" Victoria demanded, her tone still aggressive, but now tinged with confusion. Elena ignored Victoria, completely focusing her attention on the police officers. "Officers, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding here. This woman," she gestured towards Zara, "is a board member of Skybridge Airlines, and she's being denied access to her own company's lounge." The words hit the assembled crowd like a lightning strike. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones that had been recording suddenly seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of what was unfolding. Victoria's face went from red to pale in the space of a heartbeat. "That's impossible," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "She doesn't look like... she's not..." Elena pulled out her tablet and opened a corporate directory, turning the screen so the police officers could see. There, in the executive section reserved for board members, was Zara's photograph, alongside her title, Director of Operations and Strategic Development, Skybridge Airlines Board of Directors. Sarah Mitchell, who had been recording the entire encounter, felt her journalist instincts kick into overdrive. This wasn't just a story about discrimination in customer service. This was about a board member being treated as a criminal in her own company's facility. She discreetly sent a message to her editor, "Drop everything. I've got the story of the year." Marcus Rodriguez, who had been watching the confrontation with growing discomfort, suddenly understood why Zara had seemed familiar. He had seen her photograph in company materials, had probably processed her lounge access dozens of times when she traveled under corporate bookings. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered, his words carrying clearly in the suddenly silent lounge. Robert Coleman, the pilot who had been defending Zara from the beginning, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He had flown enough company executives to recognize the signs of real authority, and Zara had displayed them from the moment she walked into the lounge. The lead police officer, Detective James Morrison, examined Elena's tablet with the careful attention of someone who realized he was dealing with a situation far more complex than a simple trespassing complaint. His partner, Officer Lisa Martinez, was already taking notes and looking distinctly uncomfortable with their role in what was clearly a corporate disaster in progress. "Ma'am," Detective Morrison said to Victoria, "can you explain why you denied lounge access to a board member of the airline that owns this facility?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The question was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through all her justifications and protocols to expose the core issue. She had made assumptions based on appearance and had acted on those assumptions despite having access to computer systems that would have verified Zara's identity instantly. She didn't look like..." Victoria started, then stopped, realizing that any completion of that sentence would only make her situation worse. Elena stepped forward, her tablet now displaying a timeline of events. "I have security footage from multiple angles," she announced, her voice carrying throughout the lounge. "Every word, every action, every assumption is documented. This entire incident has been recorded not just by passengers but by the airport surveillance system." The revelation sent a chill through Victoria and Jennifer Walsh, who had been standing supportively beside her manager throughout the confrontation. Airport surveillance footage was subpoenaed material in discrimination lawsuits, and both women suddenly realized the legal implications of their actions. Lisa Martinez, the junior police officer, had been watching the crowd of passengers during Elena's presentation. What she saw was a collection of witnesses who were not just sympathetic to Zara's situation, they were angry on her behalf. Several were still recording, others were typing rapidly on their phones, sharing the story across social media platforms in real time. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said to Zara, "would you like to file a formal complaint about your treatment here today?" Zara looked around the lounge at Victoria's pale face, at Jennifer's obvious panic, at Marcus's mortified expression, at the crowd of passengers who had witnessed her humiliation. When she spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "Officer," she said, "I think the situation is going to resolve itself through appropriate channels. But I do want this incident fully documented for future reference." The phrase "appropriate channels" carried an ominous weight that Victoria was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about customer service complaints or even discrimination lawsuits. This was about corporate governance, board oversight, and the kind of consequences that could reshape entire departments. Elena was already making phone calls, her voice low but urgent, as she contacted various levels of the Skybridge's corporate hierarchy. Each call was brief, professional, and increasingly dire in its implications. The words "board member discrimination" and "full documentation" appeared in every conversation. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell's footage was already going viral on social media. The travel blog community was tight-knit and influential, and word of a board member being mistreated by her own airline spread like wildfire through industry networks. Within minutes, the story had been picked up by aviation news sites and was beginning to appear on mainstream social media platforms. Robert Coleman, who understood the airline industry's interconnected nature, could see the domino effect beginning. Stories like this didn't stay contained within company walls, they spread throughout the entire aviation community, affecting reputation, stock prices, and regulatory scrutiny. "This is going to be bigger than just Skybridge," he murmured to Maria Santos, who nodded grimly. The lounge itself had become a kind of theater, with passengers openly discussing what they had witnessed and sharing contact information to ensure their testimonies would be available for any subsequent investigations. The atmosphere of exclusive luxury had been replaced by something more powerful, a collective witness to injustice being documented and prepared for accountability. Victoria, who had started the day as the confident manager of an exclusive lounge, found herself at the center of a corporate crisis that was expanding beyond her control or comprehension. The boarding pass she still held in her hand had become evidence of her discrimination, and every moment she continued to hold it made her legal situation worse. Detective Morrison, who had initially expected to handle a routine trespassing call, realized he was now dealing with potential civil rights violations, corporate misconduct, and a situation that was likely to attract federal attention. His incident report was going to be read by lawyers, corporate executives, and possibly congressional staffers if the story continued to grow. The second wave of arrivals began 20 minutes after Elena's appearance, and each new person who entered the lounge carried more authority than the last. Captain Michael Torres, Skybridge's chief pilot, strode through the entrance with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in emergency situations. At 48, he commanded respect throughout the airline industry, and his presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation. Captain Torres had been conducting a flight safety meeting in the terminal's operations center when Elena's urgent call reached him. As the most senior pilot on duty and one of the few people who worked directly with the board of directors on safety protocols, he understood immediately that this wasn't just a customer service issue, it was a corporate emergency that could have far-reaching consequences for the airline's reputation and operations. "Zara," he said, simply approaching her with the kind of professional respect that made Victoria's earlier treatment look even more egregious by comparison. "I apologize for what you've experienced here today." His acknowledgement of Zara's identity was unmistakable, and public confirming for everyone present that she was exactly who Elena had claimed. The contrast between Captain Torres' respectful demeanor and Victoria's earlier hostility created a stark visual representation of how dramatically wrong the lounge manager had been. Victoria watched this exchange with growing horror, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. Captain Torres wasn't just any pilot. He was someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the company, someone whose incident reports reached the highest levels of corporate leadership. Rebecca Thompson, the customer relations director, arrived next, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. At 41, Rebecca had handled numerous customer service crises, but she could tell immediately that this situation was unlike anything she had encountered before. The presence of police officers recording passengers and a visibly shaken lounge staff told her that damage control would be complex and extensive. Miss Williams Rebecca said, using Zara's formal title with the kind of deference that made Victoria wince on behalf of Skybridge Airlines. "I want to express our deepest regret for this incident." Rebecca's training in crisis management kicked in as she began mentally cataloging the steps needed to contain the situation. Legal notifications, media response, internal investigations, policy reviews. The list was extensive and urgent. But first, she needed to understand exactly what had occurred and who was responsible. Amanda Foster, legal affairs manager, entered the lounge like a storm, front her briefcase and determined expression, signaling that the corporate response had escalated to its highest level. At 35, Amanda had handled discrimination cases before, but usually as defensive actions taken months after incidents occurred. Being present during an active situation gave her unique insight into both the legal exposure and the potential for immediate intervention. "I need to speak with everyone involved." Amanda announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that every word spoken from this point forward could appear in court documents. This entire incident needs to be documented according to legal protocols. The arrival of these authority figures transformed the atmosphere in the lounge completely. What had begun as a customer service dispute was now clearly a corporate crisis requiring executive-level intervention. Passengers who had been watching with curiosity now understood they were witnessing something historically significant. Sarah Mitchell, still recording, realized that her footage had evolved from a simple discrimination incident into documentation of a corporate reckoning. The story she had stumbled upon was becoming more complex and significant with each new arrival. Detective Morrison found himself in the unusual position of investigating an incident where the alleged victim held a position of authority over many of the people involved in the response. His normal protocols for handling discrimination complaints didn't account for situations where the complainant was a board member of the organization being complained about. Marcus Rodriguez, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout the incident, finally found the courage to speak. "I tried to tell her," he said quietly to Captain Torres, referring to Victoria. The computer system showed miss. Williams' reservation was valid. I recognized her name from company materials, but Victoria wouldn't listen. His words carried weight because they confirmed that the airline's own systems and employees had provided information that could have prevented the entire incident. Victoria's decision to override both computer verification and employee input demonstrated a level of bias that went beyond simple misunderstanding. Jennifer Walsh, the assistant manager, realized that her support of Victoria's actions had implicated her in the discrimination. As the corporate officials continued to arrive, her attempts to distance herself from the incident became increasingly desperate. "I was just following Victoria's lead," Jennifer said to Rebecca Thompson, her voice barely concealing her panic. She said it was standard protocol for questionable documentation, but her words only made the situation worse, confirming that there had been a deliberate pattern of scrutiny applied specifically to Zara that wouldn't have been applied to other passengers. The phrase questionable documentation would appear in legal briefs as evidence of pretextual discrimination. Elena continued coordinating the corporate response, her tablet constantly pinging with messages from various levels of company leadership. The story was already spreading beyond social media into mainstream news outlets, and the company's stock price had begun to fluctuate in response to the negative publicity. Thomas Anderson, regional airport director, arrived with the kind of urgency reserved for security threats or major operational failures. At 55, he had overseen thousands of passenger interactions at LAX, but he had never dealt with a situation where an airline's board member had been discriminated against in their own company's facility. The sight of police officers, corporate executives, and recording passengers in the Skybridge lounge told him immediately that this incident would require coordination between airport operations, airline management, and potentially federal oversight agencies. "This is a disaster," Thomas murmured to Rebecca Thompson as he surveyed the scene. "How did it get this far?" Rebecca's response was professional but pointed. It got this far because established protocols were ignored and personal bias replaced professional judgment. Her words were diplomatically phrased, but their meaning was clear. Victoria's actions had created a corporate crisis that could have been avoided if she had simply followed standard procedures and treated all passengers with equal respect. Carmen Valdez, Vice President of Customer Experience, entered the lounge with an expression that made everyone present understand the seriousness of the situation. At 42, Carmen was responsible for overall customer satisfaction across Skybridge's entire operation. And this incident represented a catastrophic failure in her area of responsibility. "I want a complete timeline of events." Carmen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers. "Every action, every word, every decision needs to be documented and analyzed." Stephen Brooks, corporate communications director, was already working his phone as he entered, coordinating with the airline's public relations team to prepare statements and responses for the media attention that was building around the story. The convergence of so many high-level executives in the Premier Lounge created an atmosphere of crisis management that made Victoria's earlier confidence seem absurdly misplaced. She had gone from being the authority figure controlling access to premium services to being the subject of investigation by the airline's entire senior leadership team. The moment that crystallized the full scope of Victoria's mistake came when Carmen Valdez opened her tablet and displayed Skybridge Airlines' organizational chart for everyone present to see. There, in the section reserved for board members and senior executives, was Zara Williams's photograph, alongside a biography that read like a testament to excellence in aviation leadership. Zara Williams, Director of Operations and Strategic Development, Carmen, read aloud, her voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent lounge. Former commercial pilot with over 3000 flight hours. MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business. Joined Skybridge Board of Directors at age 28, youngest person ever appointed to that position. Currently overseeing the company's 5-year strategic expansion plan and diversity initiative implementation. Each word landed like a hammer blow against Victoria's earlier assumptions. The woman she had dismissed as a potential fraud was not only legitimate, she was one of the most qualified and accomplished people ever to hold a position on Skybridge's board. But the biography continued, and the details became even more damning to Victoria's treatment of her. Prior to joining the board, Miss Williams spent 4 years as a commercial pilot for Skybridge, during which time she received commendations for safety excellence and customer service leadership. She holds commercial pilot licenses for multiple aircraft types and maintains active flight status. The revelation that Zara was herself a pilot, someone who understood aviation operations from the most fundamental level, made Victoria's questioning of her right to access airline services appear even more absurd. Sarah Mitchell, still recording, caught Victoria's face as this information was being revealed. The lounge manager's expression shifted from defiance to confusion to what appeared to be dawning horror as she realized the full extent of her error. Captain Torres stepped forward to add context that made the situation even more significant. Zara was in New York yesterday for an emergency board meeting about route expansion and safety protocols, he explained to the assembled group. She was supposed to be on a company jet, but she chose to fly commercial to test our passenger services firsthand. The irony was devastating. Victoria had discriminated against the very person who was responsible for overseeing customer service improvements throughout the airline. Zara's presence in the lounge wasn't random. It was part of her official duties as a board member evaluating the passenger experience. Elena, who had been coordinating communications throughout the crisis, provided additional context that made Victoria's actions even more inexplicable. Miss Williams has flown through this exact lounge dozens of times over the past 4 years, she said, consulting her tablet. She has platinum status with Skybridge, and her corporate profile includes a photograph that should be accessible to all customer service staff. Marcus Rodriguez, who'd been growing increasingly mortified as more details emerged, finally spoke up. I knew I recognized her, he said quietly. I've processed her lounge access before. Her corporate account is flagged as VIP status. His admission confirmed that the airline's own systems had contained all the information necessary to avoid the entire incident. Victoria's decision to override both computer verification and employee recognition demonstrated a level of bias that went beyond simple procedural error. Amanda Foster, the legal affairs manager, was taking detailed notes as each piece of information emerged. From a legal perspective, the case was becoming stronger with every revelation. The combination of documented discrimination, ignored internal protocols, and the victim's high-profile status within the company created exposure for both individual and institutional liability. Detective Morrison, who had initially responded to what he thought was a routine trespassing call, found himself documenting what appeared to be a clear case of discrimination against one of the most senior executives in the airline industry. His incident report would likely be reviewed by federal civil rights investigators. Rebecca Thompson, recognizing the need for immediate damage control, addressed the gathered passengers who had witnessed the incident. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the authority of her position, Skybridge Airlines sincerely apologizes for the inappropriate treatment you have witnessed today. This incident does not represent our company's values or policies, but her words rang hollow in the context of what had actually occurred. The passengers had seen with their own eyes how a board member of the airline had been treated, and no amount of corporate apology could erase the visual evidence they had recorded and shared. One passenger, an elderly gentleman who had been observing from a corner table, stood and addressed the assembled executives directly. I've been flying Skybridge for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. If this is how you treat your own board members, how can customers trust that you'll treat us with respect? His question highlighted the broader implications of the incident. This wasn't just about one manager's poor judgment. It was about organizational culture training protocols, and the fundamental question of whether Skybridge Airlines could be trusted to provide equitable service to all passengers. Carmen Valdez understood that the passengers' concern represented the exact kind of reputation damage that could take years to repair. Customer loyalty in the airline industry was built on trust and consistency, and this incident had shattered both. Thomas Anderson, the airport director, provided additional context that made the situation even more serious from an operational perspective. This lounge serves as a showcase for Skybridge's premium services, he explained to the corporate executives. It's visited by industry analysts, travel writers, and potential corporate clients on a regular basis. Today's incident was witnessed by exactly the kind of influential travelers who shape public opinion about airline quality. The strategic implications were staggering. The Skybridge Premier Lounge at LAX wasn't just a customer service facility, it was a marketing tool designed to attract high-value passengers and corporate accounts. Victoria's actions had turned that marketing tool into a liability that could affect business relationships and revenue streams. Elena consulted her tablet and provided a real-time update that demonstrated how quickly the story was spreading. The incident has been shared over 10,000 times on social media in the past hour, she reported. It's trending on Twitter under Skybridge discrimination, and it's been picked up by 3 major aviation news outlets. The speed of the story's spread was a testament to both the power of social media and the significance of what had occurred. Discrimination incidents involving ordinary passengers might generate local news coverage, but discrimination against a board member of a major airline was national news. Stephen Brooks, still coordinating with the communications team, provided updates that showed the broader impact. We're getting calls from reporters at CNN Fox Business and the Wall Street Journal, he reported. The story is moving beyond aviation industry publications into mainstream business news. Zara herself had remained relatively quiet during the revelation of her background and qualifications, allowing others to provide the context that made Victoria's treatment of her so obviously inappropriate. But as the scope of the media attention became clear, she finally spoke. "I didn't come here today looking for this kind of attention," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the lounge. "I came here as part of my responsibility to ensure that Skybridge provides excellent service to all passengers. What I experienced instead was exactly the kind of discrimination that drives customers away and damages our company's reputation." Her words were measured and professional, but they carried an authority that made clear she wasn't speaking as a victim, seeking sympathy. She was speaking as a board member, identifying operational failures that required immediate correction. The final phase of the crisis response began with the arrival of Diana Phillips, Skybridge Airlines' chief executive officer. Her presence was announced not by fanfare, but by the subtle shift in body language that occurred when everyone in the lounge realized that the company's top executive had personally responded to the situation. Diana Phillips, at 51, had built her reputation on decisive leadership and zero tolerance for discrimination within her organization. Her silver hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense style that matched her direct approach to corporate management, and her expression as she surveyed the scene in the Premier Lounge made clear that heads would roll before the day was over. "Somebody explained to me," Diana said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "how one of my board members ended up being harassed by my own staff in my own facility." The question was rhetorical but devastating. It framed the incident not as a customer service failure but as an organizational breakdown that reflected directly on executive leadership. Victoria, who had been hoping to blend into the background as more senior executives arrived, found herself the focal point of the CEO's attention. Gabriel Martinez, Vice President of Human Resources, had arrived with Diana and was already reviewing personnel files on his tablet. At 44, Gabriel had handled numerous discrimination cases throughout his career, but he had never dealt with one involving such high-profile individuals and so much public documentation. Miss Ashford Gabriel said, "Consulting Victoria's employee record, you've been with Skybridge for 3 years as Premier Lounge Manager. During that time, have you received training on our non-discrimination policies?" Victoria's answer was barely audible. "Yes, sir. And do you understand that those policies apply to all passengers regardless of their appearance, race, or your personal assumptions about their ability to afford premium services? Yes, sir. Gabriel's questions were being asked in front of a crowd of witnesses, making them both an investigation and a public acknowledgement of policy violations. Each answer Victoria gave was documenting her awareness of the standards she had violated. Nicole, Harper Chief Marketing Officer, was simultaneously managing the immediate crisis and calculating the long-term damage to Skybridge's brand reputation. At 37, she understood that the airline industry was particularly vulnerable to discrimination scandals, and this incident had all the elements necessary to create lasting damage. "We're looking at months of negative coverage," Nicole whispered to Diana Phillips. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about whether customers can trust us to treat them fairly." Diana nodded grimly. She had spent 5 years building Skybridge's reputation as a premium airline that valued diversity and inclusion. One manager's bias had potentially undone years of careful brand development. Elena continued coordinating communications, but the updates she was receiving painted an increasingly dire picture. "The story has been picked up by international aviation publications," she reported. "We're getting inquiries from reporters in London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo." The global reach of the story reflected both the international nature of the airline industry and the universal resonance of discrimination incidents. What had started as a local customer service failure was becoming an international case study in corporate bias and accountability. Captain Torres provided operational context that highlighted additional concerns. "Zara's flight to London tonight is fully booked with corporate executives and potential partners," he said. "Word of this incident is going to spread throughout the business community she's traveling to meet." The realization that Zara's professional travels would carry the story directly to Skybridge's business partners and potential clients added another layer of urgency to the crisis response. This wasn't just about media coverage, it was about relationships that could affect the company's bottom line. Amanda Foster, who had been documenting every aspect of the incident for legal purposes, provided an assessment that made clear the severity of the situation. "From a liability perspective, we're dealing with potential civil rights violations, breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders, and possible federal oversight," she said. "The fact that the victim is a board member creates a unique exposure that could affect corporate governance." Her analysis highlighted something that everyone present was beginning to understand. This incident went beyond typical discrimination cases because it involved the governance structure of the company itself. A board member being discriminated against by employees raised questions about organizational culture that could attract regulatory attention. Thomas Anderson, recognizing the broader implications for airport operations, provided additional context. "LAX handles over 87 million passengers annually," he said. "If customers lose confidence in Skybridge's treatment of passengers, it could affect our gate assignments, terminal lease negotiations, and relationship with other airlines." The airport's concern about its relationship with Skybridge highlighted how discrimination incidents could have cascading effects throughout the aviation industry ecosystem. Sarah Mitchell, who had been documenting the corporate response as thoroughly as she had documented the initial incident, realized that her story had evolved into something unprecedented. She was witnessing real-time corporate accountability at the highest level, with a CEO personally responding to discrimination within her own company. Diana Phillips, after consulting with her legal and communications teams, made a decision that would define Skybridge's response to the crisis. "Miss Ashford," she said, addressing Victoria directly, "you are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Your access to company facilities is revoked, and you will be escorted from the premises." The swift action sent a clear message to both employees and customers that discrimination would not be tolerated at any level of the organization. But Diana wasn't finished. "Miss Walsh," she continued, addressing the assistant manager, "you are also suspended pending investigation for your role in supporting discriminatory actions." Jennifer Walsh's face went white as she realized that her decision to back Victoria's actions had cost her own job. The message to other employees was unmistakable. Supporting discrimination was as unacceptable as perpetrating it. Gabriel Martinez stepped forward to address the broader implications for company policy. Effective immediately, all customer service staff will receive mandatory bias training, he announced. We're also implementing new protocols that require management approval before any passenger can be denied service or have their documentation questioned. The policy changes were being announced publicly in front of passengers and media representatives, making them both a commitment to improvement and a marketing message about Skybridge's values. Carmen Valdez, recognizing the need for immediate service recovery, addressed Zara directly. Miss Williams, on behalf of Skybridge Airlines, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable treatment. We're implementing immediate changes to ensure this never happens again to any passenger. But Zara's response surprised everyone present. Carmen, she said, I appreciate the apology, but I'm more interested in long-term changes than immediate reactions. This incident revealed problems that go deeper than one manager's bias. Her focus on institutional change rather than personal satisfaction demonstrated the kind of leadership thinking that had made her valuable as a board member. She was viewing the incident not as a personal affront, but as data about organizational weaknesses that needed correction. The corporate response continued with Stephen Brooks announcing that Skybridge would be releasing a public statement within the hour, accepting full responsibility for the incident and detailing the steps being taken to prevent similar occurrences. Elena, monitoring social media response, provided updates that showed public reaction was beginning to shift. The company's quick response and immediate consequences for the responsible employees is generating positive commentary, she reported. People are contrasting our response with other airlines that have handled discrimination incidents poorly. The speed and decisiveness of Skybridge's response was becoming part of the story, potentially limiting long-term damage to the company's reputation. The transformation of the Premier Lounge from a site of discrimination into a boardroom for organizational reform happened with remarkable speed. Within an hour of Diana Phillips's arrival, the space had been cleared of regular passengers and converted into a crisis management center where the future of Skybridge's customer service policies would be determined. Marcus Rodriguez, who had tried to prevent the incident from escalating, found himself in an unexpected position of influence. Diana Phillips had personally asked him to remain and provide his perspective on what had occurred, recognizing that his attempt to follow proper protocols made him a valuable witness rather than a target for discipline. Marcus Diana said, consulting the notes that Gabriel Martinez had provided about his employment record, "You've been with us for 8 months and your performance reviews have been excellent. Tell me what you think went wrong today." Marcus took a deep breath before responding, understanding that his answer would influence company policy. Miss Phillips, the computer system, verified Miss Williams' reservation immediately. Her documentation was valid and I recognized her from company materials. But Victoria ignored all of that information and made her decision based on other factors. His diplomatic phrasing of other factors allowed everyone present to understand what he meant without forcing him to make direct accusations. It was a professionally mature response that impressed the senior executives who were listening. Elena, who had been coordinating with board members who hadn't been present, provided updates that showed the incident's impact on corporate governance. The full board has been briefed on the situation, she reported. They're requesting a comprehensive review of customer service protocols and bias training across all divisions. The board's response demonstrated that discrimination against one member would be treated as an attack on the institution itself. This wasn't just about Zara's personal experience. It was about the integrity of the organization's leadership structure. Nicole Harper, working with her marketing team, had been monitoring public reaction across multiple platforms. "The story is evolving in our favor," she reported. "The quick consequences for responsible employees and the transparent response from senior leadership are being praised as examples of corporate accountability." Her assessment highlighted something crucial. Skybridge's response to discrimination was becoming as much a part of the story as the discrimination itself. Companies that handled similar incidents poorly served as negative examples that made Skybridge's decisive action look even more impressive by comparison. Diana Phillips, recognizing the need to address the broader implications of the incident, made an announcement that surprised everyone present. "I'm calling an emergency session of the Board of Directors," she said. "This incident has revealed gaps in our policies and training that require immediate attention at the highest level of corporate governance. The decision to involve the full board in responding to a customer service incident demonstrated the seriousness with which Skybridge was treating the situation. Board meetings were typically reserved for strategic planning and major financial decisions, not operational issues, but this incident had transcended normal categories." Amanda Foster, who had been preparing legal documentation throughout the crisis, provided an assessment that showed the potential positive outcomes of the company's response. "Our immediate action and transparent handling of the situation significantly reduces our legal exposure," she said. "More importantly, it demonstrates genuine commitment to civil rights compliance that could serve as a model for the industry." Her analysis highlighted how properly handled discrimination incidents could actually strengthen organizations by demonstrating their values and commitment to fairness. Captain Torres, representing the operational side of the airline, provided context about the incident's impact on flight crews and pilots. "This story is going to spread throughout the aviation community," he said. "How we handle it will affect our reputation with pilots, flight attendants, and other airline professionals who might consider working for Skybridge." The airline industry's interconnected nature meant that reputation among employees was as important as reputation among customers. Discrimination incidents that were handled poorly could affect recruitment and retention of qualified staff. Sarah Mitchell, who had been observing the corporate response as thoroughly as she had documented the initial incident, realized that her story was becoming something unprecedented in aviation journalism. She was witnessing a real-time case study in corporate accountability that would likely be analyzed in business schools and management training programs. Diana Phillips, after consulting with her executive team, made a decision that would define Skybridge's long-term response to the incident. "We're going to establish a new position within our corporate structure," she announced. "Director of Customer Experience and Equity, reporting directly to the CEO with the responsibility for ensuring that this type of incident never occurs again." The creation of a new executive position was a significant commitment of resources and authority to addressing discrimination. It sent a clear message that preventing bias wasn't just a training issue, it was a strategic priority that deserved C-suite attention. Thomas Anderson, recognizing the airport's role in supporting the airline's reform efforts, offered LAX's cooperation. "We're prepared to work with Skybridge on implementing new training protocols for all airline staff operating in our terminals," he said. "This incident reflects on the airport as well as the airline, and we want to be part of the solution." The airport's willingness to participate in broader reform efforts demonstrated how the incident was catalyzing industry-wide improvements rather than just company-specific changes. Carmen Valdez, who had been developing immediate action items throughout the crisis, presented a timeline for implementation of new policies. "Within 30 days, all customer-facing employees will complete updated bias training," she announced. "Within 60 days, we'll have new protocols in place for handling customer service disputes. Within 90 days, we'll have established customer feedback processes that include specific questions about discriminatory treatment." The specific timeline and measurable goals transform the company's response from reactive crisis management into proactive organizational development. Gabriel Martinez, recognizing the human resources implications of the incident, provided additional context about employee accountability. "We're implementing new hiring protocols that include bias assessment and cultural competency evaluation," he said. "We're also establishing clear consequences for discriminatory behavior that go beyond termination to include industry-wide reporting." The expansion of consequences beyond company discipline to industry-wide accountability demonstrated Skybridge's commitment to ensuring that employees who discriminated against customers couldn't simply move to other airlines and continue the same behavior. Elena, Monitoring the continuing social media response provided updates that showed the public's reaction to the corporate accountability measures. The transparency of the response and the immediate consequences are generating positive coverage across multiple platforms, she reported. Skybridge is being praised as an example of how companies should handle discrimination incidents. The positive shift in public opinion demonstrated how authentic corporate accountability could transform potential disasters into reputation-building opportunities. The organized transformation of Skybridge's approach to customer service began immediately with changes being implemented, even as the crisis management meeting continued in the Premier Lounge. The speed and comprehensiveness of the response reflected Diana Phillips' understanding that half measures would be viewed as inadequate by both customers and industry observers. Marcus Rodriguez found himself at the center of the reform effort when Carmen Valdez offered him a promotion that recognized his ethical stance during the incident. "Marcus, she said we'd like you to serve as interim manager of the Premier Lounge while we search for permanent leadership. Your actions today demonstrated the kind of judgment and integrity we need in management positions." The promotion sent a clear message throughout Skybridge's employee base. Doing the right thing during difficult situations would be rewarded, not punished. It also provided immediate practical benefits by placing someone with fresh perspective and proven ethical standards in a position of authority. Lisa Martinez, the junior staff member who had recognized Zara during the incident, was offered a position on the newly created Customer Dignity Task Force. Her ability to identify discrimination in progress and her discomfort with Victoria's actions marked her as someone who could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Lisa Gabriel Martinez explained, "We need employees who can spot problems before they become crises." Your reaction today showed exactly the kind of awareness we want to encourage throughout our organization. The task force represented a new approach to preventing discrimination. Instead of relying solely on training and policies, Skybridge was creating institutional structures that empowered employees to intervene when they witnessed bias or inappropriate treatment. Sarah Mitchell, whose documentation of the incident had been crucial in establishing the facts, was invited to participate in the company's reform efforts as an independent observer. Her role would involve monitoring implementation of new policies and providing objective assessment of their effectiveness. "We want external accountability," Diana Phillips explained. "Your documentation of today's incident was invaluable, and we'd like you to document our response efforts with the same thoroughness." The invitation to external oversight demonstrated Skybridge's commitment to transparency and genuine reform rather than cosmetic changes designed primarily for public relations purposes. Robert Coleman, the pilot who had defended Zara during the incident, was asked to serve as liaison between flight crews and management for culture change initiatives. His uniform had given weight to his intervention during the crisis, and his experience in aviation operations made him valuable for identifying potential discrimination issues that management might miss. Robert, Captain Torres, explained pilots see how passengers are treated throughout their travel experience. "We need that perspective to ensure our reforms address real problems, not just theoretical ones." The inclusion of operational personnel in reform planning ensured that changes would be practical and implementable rather than purely administrative. Elena, whose crisis management skills had been essential during the incident, was tasked with establishing ongoing monitoring processes that would prevent discrimination from recurring. Her role would involve creating feedback loops between customers, employees, and management that could identify problems before they escalated to crisis levels. Elena Carmen Valdez said, "We need early warning processes that can catch discrimination before it becomes public relations disasters." Your coordination today showed you understand how to manage complex situations involving multiple stakeholders. The focus on prevention, rather than reaction, represented a fundamental shift in how Skybridge approached customer service challenges. The reform implementation extended beyond personnel changes to include complete modification of company procedures. Gabriel Martinez announced that all customer service protocols would be rewritten to emphasize respect and dignity for all passengers, with specific procedures for handling situations where employees questioned customer documentation or right to access services. The new protocols will require supervisory approval before any passenger can be denied service, Gabriel explained. They will also mandate that customer-facing employees receive specific training on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Thomas Anderson, representing the airport's perspective, offered to coordinate with other airlines operating at LAX to establish industry-wide standards for preventing discrimination in premium service areas. The incident had highlighted how individual company policies needed to be supported by broader industry culture change. This can't just be about Skybridge, Thomas said. Passengers move between airlines and terminals throughout their travel experience. We need consistent standards across all providers to ensure that discrimination doesn't have safe havens in the aviation industry. The expansion of reform efforts beyond Skybridge to include industry-wide coordination demonstrated how individual incidents could catalyze broader social change. Amanda Foster, working with external legal counsel, established new compliance monitoring processes that would track discrimination complaints, resolution outcomes, and prevention effectiveness. The legal framework would ensure that reforms were measurable and sustainable rather than temporary responses to immediate pressure. We're creating accountability structures that will outlast current management, Amanda explained. These processes will ensure that preventing discrimination remains a priority regardless of future leadership changes. Nicole Harper, coordinating with marketing and communications teams, developed strategies for communicating reform efforts to customers and industry stakeholders. The challenge was to demonstrate genuine commitment to change without appearing to exploit the incident for promotional purposes. Our communications will focus on actions rather than promises, Nicole said. We'll document implementation progress and let results speak for our commitment rather than relying on corporate rhetoric. Stephen Brooks, managing media relations, provided updates showing that the company's reform announcements were generating positive coverage that contrasted sharply with other airlines' responses to discrimination incidents. Skybridge was being held up as an example of corporate responsibility and authentic accountability. The reform initiatives are being covered as business news rather than just discrimination stories, Stephen reported. Industry analysts are praising the comprehensive response and using it as a benchmark for evaluating other companies' crisis management. Captain Torres, representing the operational perspective, emphasized that reform efforts needed to address not just customer-facing interactions, but also internal company culture. Discrimination against passengers often reflected broader organizational problems that affected employee relationships as well. If we're going to prevent discrimination against customers, Captain Torres said we need to ensure our internal culture supports diversity and inclusion among employees. Customer service reflects organizational values, and those values need to be genuine. The recognition that external customer service quality was connected to internal organizational culture represented sophisticated understanding of how discrimination operated at multiple levels within companies. Carmen Valdez, overseeing implementation coordination, established timelines and benchmarks that would track progress and ensure accountability. The reform effort would be treated as a major organizational change project with the same rigor applied to strategic business initiatives. We'll have quarterly reviews with the board of directors, Carmen announced. Reform progress will be tied to executive compensation, and success metrics will be published in our annual reports. The integration of discrimination prevention into corporate governance and executive accountability demonstrated Skybridge's commitment to making reform efforts permanent rather than temporary responses to immediate pressure. As the immediate crisis response concluded and organized reform planning began, Zara Williams found herself in the unique position of being both the victim of discrimination and a leader responsible for preventing its recurrence. Her response to this dual role would define not only her own legacy but also Skybridge's long-term commitment to organizational change. Standing in the Premier Lounge that had been the site of her humiliation just hours earlier, Zara addressed the assembled executives, employees, and remaining witnesses with the kind of quiet authority that had made her valuable as a board member. "What happened here today was painful," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the space, but it was also revealing. We learned that our policies on paper don't always translate to respectful treatment in practice. We learned that bias can flourish even in organizations that pride themselves on diversity and inclusion. And we learned that real change requires more than good intentions. It requires organized accountability and genuine commitment from leadership. Her words reframed the incident from a personal attack into institutional learning opportunity. Rather than focusing on her own experience of discrimination, she emphasized the broader lessons that could benefit all passengers and employees. Diana Phillips, recognizing the grace and leadership Zara was demonstrating, made an announcement that surprised everyone present. "Zara," she said, "I'd like you to consider accepting the position of Director of Customer Experience and Equity that we're creating in response to this incident. Your experience today, combined with your operational knowledge and board perspective, makes you uniquely qualified to lead these reform efforts." The offer represented a remarkable transformation, the victim of discrimination being asked to lead the organization's efforts to prevent future discrimination. It also demonstrated Skybridge's commitment to placing authority for change in the hands of someone who understood its necessity from personal experience. Zara's response reflected careful consideration of both the opportunity and its implications. "I'll accept that position," she said, "with the understanding that success will be measured not by the policies we write, but by the experiences of passengers and employees who come after us. Real change happens when people who have never experienced discrimination don't have to worry about it because our processes and culture have made it impossible." Her acceptance speech became a mission statement that established expectations for the reform effort's success would be measured by prevention rather than response, by structural change rather than individual accountability. Marcus Rodriguez, who had been promoted to interim lounge manager, found himself responsible for transforming the culture of the facility where the incident had occurred. His first act was to address the staff members who had witnessed Victoria's actions without intervening. "We're going to create an environment where doing the right thing is easier than staying silent," Marcus announced to his team. "That means training support and clear protocols that make it safe for employees to prevent discrimination rather than hoping someone else will handle it." Elena, whose crisis management had been crucial throughout the incident, was tasked with documenting the lessons learned and ensuring they were incorporated into Skybridge's broader organizational development efforts. Her role would involve creating case studies and training materials that could be used throughout the aviation industry. Sarah Mitchell, whose recording of the incident had been essential in establishing accountability, agreed to continue documenting Skybridge's reform implementation. Her independent perspective would provide credibility to the company's claims of genuine change. 3 months later, the Premier Lounge had been transformed from a site of discrimination into a model of inclusive customer service. The changes were visible immediately. Diverse staff trained in bias prevention, clear protocols for addressing customer concerns, and an atmosphere of respect that extended to all passengers regardless of their appearance or background. Customer satisfaction scores for the lounge reached all-time highs, but more importantly, the changes had spread throughout Skybridge's operation. The incident that had begun with one manager's bias had catalyzed company-wide cultural transformation that became an industry benchmark. Victoria Ashford's case became a training example used throughout the aviation industry not as punishment, but as education about how unconscious bias could destroy careers and damage organizations. Her story served as a cautionary tale that helped prevent similar incidents at other airlines. The legacy of the incident extended far beyond Skybridge Airlines. Industry organizations adopted new standards for customer service training, airports implemented discrimination reporting processes, and federal agencies updated civil rights compliance requirements for airlines. What struck me most about Zara's story wasn't just her composure under pressure. It was her choice to transform personal humiliation into institutional change. She could have sought revenge, demanded apologies, or simply moved on with her life. Instead, she chose the harder path of organized reform that would protect future passengers from experiencing what she endured. Victoria's downfall serves as a reminder that bias isn't just morally wrong, it's professionally destructive. In today's connected world, discrimination becomes public instantly, and organizations are judged not just by their policies but by their authentic commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect. The real victory in this story wasn't Zara reclaiming her rightful place in the Premier Lounge. It was the creation of processes and culture that made discrimination less likely for everyone who came after her. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger. It's the patient work of building something better. If you're facing discrimination, remember Zara's example: document everything, maintain your dignity, and focus on creating change that extends beyond your own situation. Your response in moments of injustice can shape not just your outcome but the experiences of countless others who follow in your footsteps. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage and justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because together we can create a world where dignity and respect aren't privileges, they're guarantees for everyone. What did you think of Zara's response? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know about a time when you or someone you know stood up against discrimination. Your story matters, and sharing it helps us all learn and grow together.